Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for week 13, focusing on the difference rhetoric makes to New Testament interpretation. Redefining the interpretive paradigm from epistolary to rhetorical. The dominant paradigm for examining Pauline and other New Testament discourses has traditionally relied on epistolary conventions, which often proves inadequate for capturing the persuasive thrust of these texts. When we open the pages of the New Testament, particularly the epistles, we must profoundly shift our modern assumptions. We live in a highly literate, text-based culture where letters and emails are consumed silently and privately. The biblical world, however, was fundamentally an oral culture. Texts were incredibly expensive to produce and were almost universally intended to be read aloud to a gathered community. Therefore, treating these documents merely as standard letters drastically limits our understanding. They are not simply conveying information, they are surrogate speeches. The apostles could not be physically present, so they sent written orations designed to be performed. This means that the categories we typically use to analyze letters only scratch the surface. They might explain the opening greetings or the final sign-offs, but they fail to illuminate the vast middle sections where the actual theological and ethical work is accomplished. Analyzing the majority of the New Testament on the basis of epistolary conventions, many of which did not become standard nor put into a handbook until after New Testament times, has no business being the dominant literary paradigm. This statement challenges the very foundation of much historical biblical scholarship. For generations, scholars have attempted to force Pauline texts into rigid epistolary categories like the Thanksgiving prayer or the body middle. Yet, as world-class scholarship demonstrates, these categories were not even formalized in antiquity during the 1st century. Instead, the Greco-Roman world was utterly saturated with rhetoric. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was the core of advanced education and public life. If we truly want to grasp what difference rhetoric makes to New Testament interpretation, we must recognize that the authors employed macro-rhetorical structures. They used an exordium to win the audience's goodwill, a narratio to lay out the background, a propositio to state their core thesis, and a peroratio to appeal to the deepest emotions. By applying rhetorical criticism rather than mere epistolary analysis, we recover the dynamic, persuasive power of the text. We begin to see how the authors strategically organized their arguments to change the beliefs and behaviors of their ancient listeners, providing us with a far more accurate and historically grounded exegesis. The oral matrix, reading texts as oratorical surrogates. The cultures of the biblical world were essentially oral cultures, where texts functioned primarily as necessary surrogates for oral communication and were meant to be delivered aloud. To truly interpret the New Testament accurately, we must transport ourselves into a world where the spoken word reigns supreme. In our modern context, widespread literacy allows us to read silently, processing complex theological arguments at our own pace. But in the 1st century, the literacy rate hovered anywhere from 5 to 20%. For the vast majority of early Christians, encountering a letter from Paul or a gospel narrative meant hearing it performed by a trained reader in a gathered assembly. These texts were not static repositories of data, they were living voices. When an apostle wrote to a congregation, the document served as a substitute for his physical presence and oral delivery. This profoundly changes how we analyze the text, because the author was not writing for the eye, but for the ear. Because of the prohibitive cost of document production and the practice of scriptio continua, documents were composed with their oral potential in mind, relying heavily on rhetorical devices to guide the reader. Imagine trying to read a manuscript written in all capital letters with absolutely no spaces between words, no commas, and no periods. This was the reality of scriptio continua in the ancient world. The only way to decipher such a document was to sound it out aloud. Therefore, biblical authors strategically embedded rhetorical devices like alliteration, assonance, rhythmic patterns, and catchwords directly into their prose. These linguistic features functioned as a form of auditory punctuation, signaling to the reader where to pause, what to emphasize, and how to deliver the emotional weight of the argument. When we interpret these texts today, recognizing this oral matrix compels us to pay close attention to these oral markers. They are not merely decorative literary flourishes, they are essential components of the text's persuasive strategy, guiding the audience toward the author's intended theological and ethical conclusions. Analyzing Markan rhetoric, narrative and Kriya. The Gospel of Mark employs the rhetoric of narrative, specifically utilizing the progymnasmata exercise of the Kriya, a concise, memorable anecdote revealing character and historical substance. When we shift our focus to the Gospels, we might wonder if rhetoric still applies, given that they are narratives rather than epistles. The answer is a resounding yes. The authors of the Gospels were actively engaging in persuasion, utilizing foundational rhetorical exercises known from ancient education, called the progymnasmata. One of the most critical forms found in Mark is the Kriya. A Kriya is a short, punchy story that culminates in a memorable saying or action by a specific historical figure. Think of the famous interactions Jesus has with the Pharisees or his disciples. These are not random historical memories, they are carefully selected and rhetorically shaped anecdotes designed to reveal the profound character and authority of Jesus. Mark uses these concise units to construct a compelling, fast-paced narrative that drives the listener toward a verdict about who Jesus truly is. Instead of viewing the Gospels merely as collections of disjointed traditions, rhetorical analysis reveals them as deliberate biographical narratives crafted to persuade audiences about the identity of Jesus. For decades, older methods of biblical scholarship, such as form criticism, treated the Gospels as if they were simply boiled up from isolated fragments of oral tradition, pasted together without much overarching design. However, an understanding of ancient rhetoric completely overturns this assumption. The Gospel writers were not passive collectors, they were active, skilled editors. They boiled down extensive memoirs and testimonies into potent, persuasive narratives. The construction and elaboration of Kriya in Mark demonstrate a highly effective level of micro-rhetoric. By focusing on these rhetorical units, we discover that Mark's Gospel is not just a chronicle of past events, but a dynamic biographical argument, carefully calibrated to strengthen the faith of believers and persuade outsiders in the context of early Christian evangelism. Lucan historiography and the rhetoric of speeches. Luke operates as a rhetorically informed Hellenistic historian, integrating meticulously crafted speech summaries that serve as essential features of the action and the spread of the word. As we move from Mark to the two-volume work of Luke and Acts, we encounter a significantly higher level of rhetorical sophistication. Luke is writing salvation history, and he does so by employing the recognized conventions of ancient Greek historiography. In this tradition, speeches were not mere commentary on the sidelines, they were the very engines that drove the historical narrative forward. In the book of Acts, speeches make up a massive portion of the text because the early Christian movement was fundamentally propelled by the proclaimed, persuasive word. Whether it is Peter at Pentecost, Stephen before the Sanhedrin, or Paul in the city of Athens, these speeches are rhetorical masterpieces that precipitate historical action and demonstrate the unstoppable progress of the gospel. The speeches in Acts are not verbatim transcripts but rhetorically appropriate epitomes tailored to the speaker, the audience, and the theological occasion, following ancient historiographical conventions. In antiquity, without the benefit of audio recorders, historians were not expected to provide exact word-for-word quotations of public addresses. Instead, the established convention was to provide an accurate summary that captured the essence of the argument while suiting the style and tone to the specific speaker and setting. Luke executes this brilliantly. He adapts his Greek style, sometimes sounding very Jewish and biblical, a technique known as Septuagintalizing, to lend prophetic authority to Peter or James. In other contexts, such as Paul speaking to pagan philosophers, Luke utilizes classical rhetorical strategies like insinuatio, where the speaker gently builds rapport before introducing highly controversial topics like the resurrection of the dead. By recognizing these rhetorical dynamics, our interpretation of Acts is vastly enriched, revealing how the early church dynamically contextualized its message to persuade a remarkably diverse ancient world. Deliberative rhetoric in 1 Corinthians. The appeal for concord. 1 Corinthians is a masterful example of deliberative rhetoric, aimed primarily at persuading a deeply divided community to pursue future concord, unity, and advantageous behavior. When we turn to the letters of Paul, rhetoric makes an immediate and profound difference in how we structure our interpretation. 1 Corinthians is often read as a haphazard collection of answers to random pastoral problems. However, rhetorical analysis reveals it to be a unified, highly strategic deliberative discourse. In the ancient world, deliberative rhetoric was the language of the political assembly. Its primary function was to advise an audience on a future course of action, arguing that a certain path would bring advantage and benefit to the community, while the opposite would bring harm. Paul adopts this very framework to address the factionalism tearing the Corinthian church apart. He is not merely handing down apostolic decrees, he is actively persuading them to choose the path of mutual love and communal solidarity. The propositio in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 10 establishes the foundational goal of unity, which governs and illuminates the diverse arguments addressing specific community problems throughout the epistle. In any formal rhetorical speech, the propositio serves as the central thesis statement. For Paul, this thesis is a desperate plea for the Corinthians to be united in the same mind and the same purpose. Once we identify this rhetorical anchor, every subsequent chapter snaps into focus. Why does Paul discuss the scandal of lawsuits among believers? Why does he delve into the complex issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols? Why does he meticulously regulate the use of spiritual gifts in worship? The answer is always the same: to dismantle division and construct unity. Understanding the deliberative nature of the text clarifies that Paul's ethical instructions are not disconnected rules, but interconnected proofs designed to foster communal harmony. His ultimate goal is the advantageous building up of the body of Christ. The epideictic function of the Christ hymn. In Philippians, Paul utilizes epideictic rhetoric, the rhetoric of praise and display within a broader deliberative framework to present the life and character of Christ as the supreme exemplum. While deliberative rhetoric focuses on the future, and forensic rhetoric focuses on the past, epideictic rhetoric is deeply rooted in the present. It is the rhetoric of the funeral oration or the civic celebration, designed to praise virtue and blame vice. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul brilliantly weaves an epideictic masterpiece into his ongoing pastoral argument. He knows that simply telling a community to stop bickering is rarely effective. Instead, he paints a breathtaking portrait of virtue to captivate their imaginations. He uses the rhetorical technique of exemplification, holding up the ultimate paradigm of selfless behavior so that the audience cannot help but be moved to emulate it. The Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2 is not merely a detached theological or liturgical insert, it rhetorically functions to excite the audience's admiration and compel their imitation of Christ's humility. For many years, scholars debated whether this majestic poem about Christ emptying himself and taking the form of a servant was a pre-existing hymn awkwardly inserted into the text. Rhetorical criticism, however, demonstrates its absolute necessity to Paul's argument. Paul praises the mindset of Christ, the willing surrender of status and the embrace of sacrificial love, because this is the exact mindset he is begging the Philippians to adopt toward one another. The hymn is strategically deployed to stir the deepest emotions of reverence and awe. By praising the specific virtues he wishes the community to adopt, Paul seamlessly blends theological adoration with pragmatic ethical persuasion. The soaring Christology of the hymn is not an end in itself, it is the rhetorical engine driving Paul's appeal for absolute communal solidarity and selfless love. Forensic rhetoric and apologetic strategies in Galatians. While often exhibiting a fierce polemical tone, Galatians functions rhetorically as a deliberative discourse urgently advising the audience against submitting to the Mosaic law. When we read the fiery opening of Galatians, where Paul expresses his absolute astonishment that the church is deserting the gospel, it is incredibly easy to assume we are reading a forensic document. Forensic rhetoric is the language of the courtroom, it is entirely focused on attacking or defending past actions. Because Paul sounds so defensive and angry, many interpreters historically concluded that the entire letter was a forensic defense of his apostolic credentials against his opponents. However, a precise rhetorical analysis proves otherwise. The central issue at stake is not what Paul did in the past, but what the Galatians are about to do in the immediate future, specifically, whether or not they will submit to circumcision. Because the goal is to dissuade them from a future action that Paul believes will bring immense spiritual harm, the overarching framework is undeniably deliberative. Paul's autobiographical narratio in Galatians chapters 1 and 2 is not a defensive forensic apology for his past, but a strategic foundational narrative designed to establish his ethos and guide the Galatians' future choices. It is true that Paul spends the first 2 chapters recounting his dramatic conversion and his tense interactions with the Jerusalem apostles. But rhetorically, a narratio in a deliberative speech is used to remind the audience of past facts so they can make better decisions moving forward. Paul is establishing his unshakable ethos and proving that his gospel came directly from a divine revelation, not human tradition. He does this so the Galatians will trust his subsequent theological arguments. Distinguishing between the emotional tone and the argumentative substance of the rhetoric prevents the misinterpretation of Galatians. It forces us to see that Paul is not merely defending his own resume, he is fighting a desperate rhetorical battle to preserve the absolute freedom of his converts in Christ. Prosopopia and the dilemma of Romans 7. The agonizing struggle depicted in Romans chapter 7 is best understood through the rhetorical device of prosopopia, or speech in character, where Paul adopts the persona of Adam and unredeemed humanity. Romans chapter 7 contains some of the most debated verses in all of biblical literature. We hear a voice crying out, saying that what I want to do I do not do, but what I hate I do. For centuries, brilliant theologians like Augustine and Martin Luther read this text as Paul's own agonizing autobiographical confession of his ongoing, daily struggle with sin as a mature Christian. However, when we apply the lens of classical rhetoric, a completely different and far more historically accurate picture emerges. Ancient orators were highly trained in the advanced rhetorical exercise of prosopopia, the skill of impersonating a historical figure or a specific type of person to make an argument more vivid and dramatic. In this text, Paul is masterfully stepping into the character of Adam to describe the devastating entry of sin through the commandment, and then transitioning to speak on behalf of all humanity trapped outside of Christ. Failing to recognize this rhetorical impersonation has historically led to the over-psychologizing of Paul and the erroneous conclusion that he is describing the normative, defeated experience of a mature Christian. If we assume Paul is talking about his present Christian life, it flatly contradicts what he says just a few chapters earlier about believers being completely freed from the dominion of sin. Paul did not possess the highly introspective, guilt-ridden consciousness of later Western theologians. He was utilizing a standard rhetorical technique to vividly dramatize the absolute futility of relying on the law to overcome the power of the flesh. Proper rhetorical analysis clarifies that Paul is offering a profound narrative of the human plight under sin. He intentionally builds the rhetorical tension and despair to a breaking point, strictly to prepare the audience for the spectacular, triumphant declaration of absolute spiritual deliverance and victory through the Holy Spirit in Romans chapter 8. Insinuatio and the deconstruction of patronage in Philemon. In his letter to Philemon, Paul employs the delicate rhetorical strategy of insinuatio, carefully delaying his primary, controversial request until he has thoroughly secured the goodwill and emotional compliance of his audience. The short letter to Philemon is an absolute masterclass in the rhetoric of emotional appeal. Paul is writing to a wealthy slave owner regarding a runaway slave named Onesimus, who has recently converted to Christianity. In the Roman world, harboring a runaway slave was a serious offense, and Philemon had every legal right to exact brutal punishment. Because the situation is so socially and legally volatile, Paul cannot simply issue a blunt command. Instead, he utilizes insinuatio. This is a subtle rhetorical approach where the speaker intentionally holds back the main, controversial point, spending significant time building intense rapport, establishing mutual affection, and removing any potential prejudice. Paul reminds Philemon of their deep friendship and praises his character, laying a thick foundation of goodwill before ever mentioning the name of the runaway slave. By publicly reading this deeply emotional appeal in the context of the house church, Paul exerts profound rhetorical pressure, leveraging his apostolic ethos and the bonds of spiritual indebtedness. We must remember that this letter was not delivered in secret, it was read aloud in front of Philemon's entire congregation. The rhetorical pressure is enormous. Paul reminds Philemon that he is an old man, currently suffering in chains for the gospel. He gently but firmly points out that Philemon owes Paul his very spiritual life and eternal salvation. This rhetorical masterpiece subverts standard Greco-Roman conventions of patronage and slavery. Paul uses overwhelming pathos, the appeal to deep, powerful emotions, to completely deconstruct the societal norms of the day. He is not just asking for clemency, he is using every rhetorical tool at his disposal to persuade Philemon to receive Onesimus back, no longer as a piece of human property, but as an equal, beloved brother in the Lord. The synthesis of micro and macro rhetoric in exegesis. The rigorous application of rhetorical criticism to the New Testament bridges the gap between historical intent and contemporary interpretation, proving that the medium of persuasion is inseparable from the theological message. As we conclude our exploration of the profound difference rhetoric makes to New Testament interpretation, we must synthesize our findings. For too long, biblical scholarship treated the literary style of the apostles as mere decoration, entirely separate from the heavy lifting of theology. But as we have seen from the Gospels to the Epistles, the rhetorical form is deeply intertwined with the theological function. The biblical authors were not writing abstract, systematic treatises in a vacuum. They were pastors, evangelists, and historians fighting desperately in the trenches of the first century to win hearts and minds. They utilized the established, powerful tools of Greco-Roman persuasion because the very survival and unity of the early church depended on it. Recognizing micro-rhetorical devices such as diatribe, syncresis, and enthymemes within macro-rhetorical structures protects the exegete from isolating verses out of their argumentative context. When we ignore rhetoric, we run the terrible risk of plucking a single sentence out of a complex argument and twisting its meaning. But when we identify a diatribe and argument with an imaginary opponent, we know not to take every statement as the author's final conclusion. When we see a syncresis, a rhetorical comparison like Paul's contrast between Adam and Christ, we understand how the author is evaluating character to prove a larger point. These micro-devices serve the macro structure, driving the overarching thesis forward. Ultimately, understanding the rhetoric of the New Testament allows interpreters to hear the dynamic, living voice of the apostles. They were brilliant communicators who utilized every available persuasive art to transform the beliefs and behaviors of the early Christian communities. By learning to read these texts rhetorically, we finally tune our ears to hear the New Testament exactly as it was meant to be heard. Welcome to our advanced seminar. Our first topic today is the decline of rhetorical education and its impact on biblical studies. The author observes, a study of education in America during the end of the 19th and the beginnings of the 20th century is in fact a sobering study indeed if one cares about the liberal arts. Whereas major universities before the Civil War had required studies on the basis of rhetoric, logic, natural and revealed religion, and classic studies and ancient history, by the turn of the 20th century any and all of these subjects had fallen by the wayside as required courses. This represents a monumental shift in how we approach higher learning. The liberal arts, which once formed the bedrock of a well-rounded education, were systematically dismantled to make way for the pragmatic demands of the Industrial Revolution. Consequently, generations of biblical scholars have emerged from institutions completely devoid of classical training. They have not studied the Greek or Latin classics, nor have they familiarized themselves with the nuances of ancient historiography or the distinct styles of Attic and Asiatic Greek. The loss of this classical foundation means that when modern readers encounter the letters of Paul or the narratives of Luke, they lack the essential interpretive lenses required to see the texts for what they truly are. They are blind to the structural markers that would have immediately signaled a shift in argument or a change in tone to an ancient auditor. This pedagogical impoverishment has led to a proliferation of commentaries that treat the epistles as systematic theological treatises rather than dynamic, persuasive orations. We must realize that the authors of the New Testament did not sit down to write theology in a vacuum. Instead, they stood up to preach, to exhort, and to defend their nascent communities against profound existential and ideological threats using the established tools of their era. The author continues to note, much of literary criticism of the New Testament in my lifetime has been an essentially ahistorical and sometimes even an anti-historical enterprise. No wonder many classic scholars and Greek and Roman historians end up scratching their heads when they discover the anachronistic ways which many New Testament scholars evaluate their particular cache of ancient literature. This observation strikes at the very heart of our current methodological crisis. When we analyze the Gospels, Acts, or the Epistles as if they were modern works of fiction or contemporary essays, we completely misunderstand their original nature and purpose. These documents were forged in a rhetorically saturated environment where the art of persuasion dictated both form and content. By ignoring the Greco-Roman rhetorical conventions that shaped these texts, we risk turning them into mere pretexts for our own theological or literary agendas. To truly understand the New Testament, we must suspend our modern biases and immerse ourselves in the historical reality of the first-century Mediterranean world. We must learn to read and hear these texts just as their original audiences would have, recognizing the intricate rhetorical strategies designed to convict, convince, and convert. If we fail to do this, we are merely listening to the echo of our own voices rather than the authentic historical witness of the early church. Moving forward, we address answering the so what question, form reveals function. The author states, some scholars, and indeed many educated laypersons, perhaps getting lost in the minutiae of rhetorical analysis, have been prone to think that rhetoric has only to do with style or literary devices and not with the substance of a discourse. And so the cry has arisen, so what? This is a perfectly natural reaction from those who have been trained strictly in modern literary or theological methods. When presented with the complex terminology of ancient rhetorical handbooks, terms like exordium, narratio, propositio, and peroratio, it is incredibly easy to become overwhelmed by the structural details and lose sight of the broader theological narrative. Many assume that identifying these elements is merely an academic exercise, a sort of parlor trick that adds a superficial layer of historical color but does not fundamentally alter our understanding of the text itself. They ask, what difference does it make if Paul uses an enthymeme or a syncresis if the underlying theological truth remains the same? However, this skeptical posture betrays a profound misunderstanding of how communication functioned in oral cultures. In the Greco-Roman world, eloquence was not merely decorative. It was the very vehicle through which truth was established and communal identity was forged. To separate the style from the substance is to impose a modern, text-based dichotomy onto ancient, performance-based orations. The author provides a vital correction, noting, rhetoric is not just about style or the form of a discourse, but indeed the form shapes the very substance and meaning of the discourse. A few examples must suffice. This principle is absolutely critical for our exegetically task. Form and content are deeply co-entailed. The specific rhetorical species an author chooses, whether deliberative, forensic, or epideictic, fundamentally dictates the boundaries of what is being argued. For instance, if an author employs deliberative rhetoric, the primary goal is to urge a specific course of action in the near future. If we mistake this for forensic rhetoric, which defends or attacks past actions, we will inevitably misread the text, looking for legal defenses where the author is actually offering pastoral guidance. Furthermore, the placement of an argument within the overarching structure of a speech alters its weight and significance. A point made in the exordium serves to build rapport, while a similar point made in the peroration is designed to incite deep emotional response and compel immediate action. By tracing the macro-rhetorical structure of these New Testament documents, we are not merely identifying ancient literary tropes. We are tracing the very logic, the emotional cadence, and the persuasive intent of the original authors. This methodology rescues us from atomistic readings that isolate verses from their persuasive contexts, ensuring that our theological conclusions are grounded in the historical and structural reality of the text itself. Let us examine our first concrete example under the heading Illustration 1, the propositio and peroration. The text notes, one of the most revealing aspects of invention or discerning the macro-rhetorical structure of a discourse is finding its proposition statement and its peroration. Let us consider the proposition statement in Romans chapter 1 verses 16 and 17. Here Paul gives us a clear foretaste of where this whole discourse is going and what its major overarching emphasis will be. Understanding the thesis statement, or the propositio, is the single most important step in grasping the trajectory of an ancient argument. In Romans, Paul boldly declares that he is not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. This compact statement is not a comprehensive theological treatise in itself, but rather a brilliant rhetorical preview. It tells the careful listener that the ensuing discourse will tackle the universal scope of salvation, the unbroken continuity of God's promises to Israel, and the essential requirement of faithful living. If we properly identify this as the propositio, we avoid the historical trap of reducing the entire book of Romans to a singular debate over forensic justification. Instead, we see that the overarching theme is the righteousness and justice of God, a theme expansive enough to encompass the theodicy of chapters 9 through 11 and the intense ethical exhortations of the final chapters. The thesis requires unpacking, and Paul masterfully unravels it throughout the rest of the letter. By recognizing the rhetorical function of these opening verses, we align our exegesis with Paul's original intent rather than later dogmatic frameworks. The author then turns to the conclusion of a different letter, writing, Ephesians chapter 6 verses 10 through 18 provides us with one of the most stirring conclusions in all of Paul's letters. The letter itself is an example of Asiatic and epideictic rhetoric, and not surprisingly then it finishes strong with a highly emotive exhortation full of pathos. This peroration, since it is not part of a forensic or deliberative discourse, does not reiterate or summarize a previous thesis statement, but rather reinforces the general call in this discourse to continue to stand firm in one's values. The famous passage concerning the armor of God is frequently misunderstood because modern interpreters fail to recognize its function as a peroration within an epideictic discourse. Epideictic rhetoric focuses on praise and blame, aiming to strengthen an audience's commitment to values they already hold. Therefore, when Paul urges the Ephesians to put on the full armor of God, he is not suddenly introducing a new, panic-inducing crisis about demonic warfare that must be solved. He is not outlining a novel strategy for spiritual exorcism. Rather, he is employing classic rhetorical pathos. He is using vivid, martial imagery to emotionally galvanize his listeners, reassuring them that they already possess all the necessary virtues, truth, righteousness, faith, and the Spirit, to withstand any external pressure. The repeated command to simply stand firm proves that this is a discourse of encouragement, not a frantic call for a change in direction. Recognizing the genre prevents us from overinterpreting the passage and allows us to appreciate its true pastoral genius. We now explore illustration 2, misidentifying the species of rhetoric. The author explains, Hans-Dieter Betz argues in his landmark commentary on Galatians that the discourse in Galatians is forensic in character, when in fact it is deliberative. One of the mistakes made in his analysis is mistaking polemics and strong vituperation for evidence of the forensic quality of the discourse. This distinction is of paramount importance for biblical exegesis. Forensic rhetoric is the language of the law court. It is fundamentally concerned with attacking or defending actions that occurred in the past. When scholars observe the intense, fiery, and highly polemical tone of Paul's letter to the Galatians, they frequently jump to the conclusion that Paul must be acting as a defense attorney, litigating his apostolic credentials and defending his past conduct against his accusers. However, this conflates emotional intensity with rhetorical genre. A speaker can employ fierce vituperation and sharp polemics within any species of rhetoric. The true test of the genre lies in the ultimate goal of the discourse. In Galatians, Paul is not primarily concerned with securing a not guilty verdict regarding his past. Instead, he is desperately trying to advise and persuade his congregations regarding a critical decision they are about to make. He is offering urgent pastoral and ethical counsel. Since offering ethical advice and urging a specific course of action are the exclusive domains of deliberative rhetoric, classifying Galatians as a forensic defense completely derails our understanding of the apostle's primary objective. The author continues to clarify, Galatians attempts to head off the capitulation of the Galatian Christians to the persuasion of the Judaizers to get themselves circumcised and keep the Mosaic covenant. The arguments offered are meant to convince the audience that they ought not to take such a course of action either sooner or later. One of the ancillary problems that arises from misidentifying the species of rhetoric in this discourse is one will then assume the substance of the discourse will have a forensic cast or flavor to it. When we mistakenly frame Galatians as a forensic text, we inevitably force its theological concepts into a rigid, legalistic mold. For example, the profound concept of righteousness becomes reduced to a mere legal fiction, a courtroom declaration of right standing granted by a divine judge. But if we correctly identify Galatians as deliberative rhetoric, we see that Paul's appeal to the story of Abraham operates very differently. Paul argues that Abraham's faith was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness. This is not the terminology of a criminal court, but rather the language of the marketplace and the business ledger. It is a language of credits, debits, and relational exchange. The goal is to persuade the Galatians that their current trajectory toward the Mosaic law will result in profound spiritual harm, whereas maintaining their faith in Christ will secure their ultimate advantage and blessing. By correcting our rhetorical classification, we recover the dynamic, relational, and forward-looking thrust of Paul's theology, rescuing it from the sterile confines of an imagined ancient courtroom. This brings us to illustration 3, the device of impersonation. The textbook states, because we have already dealt in some depth with Romans chapter 7 verses 7 through 25 earlier in this book, we do not really need to review what was said there. Here is a case where the failure to recognize a particular rhetorical device is in play has led to whole theories about the Christian life that Paul would neither recognize nor endorse, including the simul justus edi peccator theory. The rhetorical device in question here is prosopopia, or speech in character. In ancient rhetorical training, students were taught to vividly adopt the persona of historical or representative figures to make their arguments more compelling. In Romans 7, Paul masterfully adopts the voice of Adam, and subsequently the voice of humanity trapped in the Adamic condition under the law. For centuries, heavily influenced by the introspective readings of later theologians, interpreters have mistakenly assumed that the agonizing eye of this passage was Paul speaking autobiographically about his own ongoing, daily struggle with sin as a mature Christian believer. This profound misreading birthed the pervasive theological notion that a Christian is simultaneously entirely justified yet perpetually bound to a wretched state of inescapable sin. However, recognizing the rhetorical signal of impersonation shatters this paradigm. Paul is not detailing his own Christian experience, nor is he establishing a normative expectation of defeat for the believer. Instead, he is providing a dramatic, retrospective analysis of the human plight outside of Christ, using the ultimate historical exemplar of that plight, the first man, Adam, to vividly demonstrate the sheer impotence of the law to save a fallen humanity. The author expands on this, writing, Paul talks plainly in chapter 7 verses 5 and 6 and chapter 8 verses 1 and 2 about the Christian life and what was true before and after conversion. What is clear from the context is that Paul does not believe the Christian is in bondage to sin. It should be added that impersonation was one of the most difficult of rhetorical devices to pull off convincingly. In an oral presentation it would often involve changing one's voice, or tone of voice, to let the audience know someone else was speaking. When we place the agonizing cry of chapter 7 within its broader rhetorical flow, the contrast becomes incredibly stark. Just prior to this section, Paul definitively states that believers have been discharged from the law and serve in the new life of the Spirit. Immediately following the impersonation, he joyfully declares that the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set the believer free from the law of sin and death. It makes absolutely no logical or rhetorical sense for Paul to argue for total liberation, then describe an inescapable bondage as his present reality, only to immediately return to a triumphant declaration of freedom. The oral delivery of this letter is the key. The lector, reading this epistle aloud to the Roman house churches, would have audibly shifted his tone, perhaps adopting a posture of despair, to clearly demarcate the voice of the unredeemed Adamic figure. Once we restore this performative and rhetorical dimension to the text, we recover Paul's genuinely optimistic and robust theology of grace. We realize that the Christian, empowered by the Holy Spirit, is actually equipped to overcome temptation and live a life characterized by genuine transformation, free from the paralyzing excuse of inevitable failure. Our next focus is illustration 4, the mechanics of rhetorical comparison. The text reminds us, rhetorical comparisons were things that even children were taught in the most elementary settings of classical education. They were taught it was like painting a Rembrandt painting, to use an anachronistic example. By this I mean, that if one wanted the exemplar to shine more brightly, then one had to paint as dark a picture of the villain as possible. The use of dramatic hyperbole was absolutely in order. The rhetorical exercise known as syncresis, or comparison, was a foundational building block of ancient persuasion. Its primary goal was not necessarily to provide a perfectly balanced, objective, or historically nuanced evaluation of two subjects. Rather, its purpose was deeply persuasive and inherently polemical. When drawing a comparison by contrast, the rhetorician was entirely expected to employ sharp irony, biting sarcasm, and dramatic exaggeration to ensure that the preferred option appeared as attractive as possible, while the opposing option appeared utterly repugnant. This was a recognized and appreciated art form. To analyze such a comparison using modern criteria of logical strictness or literal historical accuracy is to completely miss the point. The ancient audience understood that the stark black and white contrasts were a rhetorical strategy designed to force a decisive emotional and ethical choice, not a dispassionate theological lecture. The author highlights a prime example, stating, Paul, in a brilliant move, devises a final theological argument based on the practice of rhetorical comparison in Galatians chapter 4. In this case, Paul compares and contrasts two women, whom he says are allegorical figures representing two covenants. Modern commentators have of course often approached this passage with a wry smile, often finding it an ineffective gerrymandering of Old Testament texts and theology. But this conclusion ignores altogether the way such rhetorical comparisons were meant to work. In this famous passage, Paul equates Hagar, the slave woman, with the Sinai covenant and present earthly Jerusalem, while equating Sarah, the free woman, with the heavenly Jerusalem and the promise. To a modern exegete obsessed with literal historical grammatical interpretation, this allegorical leap seems entirely unjustified, a manipulative twisting of the sacred text. However, within the framework of ancient syncresis, Paul's move is nothing short of a masterful rhetorical strike. His goal is to absolutely shock the Galatians into casting out the Judaizing false teachers. By associating the Judaizers' insistence on the Mosaic law with slavery and the outcast Hagar, and associating his own gospel of grace with freedom and the beloved matriarch Sarah, Paul leverages deeply ingrained cultural values. No one in the ancient world would prize bondage over freedom. The logic here is not primarily exegetically. It is highly emotive and surprisingly forceful. It is designed to make the Judaizers' position socially and theologically toxic. When we understand the mechanics of this rhetorical comparison, we realize that Paul is not engaging in sloppy exegesis. He is executing a highly sophisticated and culturally resonant argument designed to secure the absolute allegiance of his imperiled flock. Let us consider illustration 5, modern versus ancient persuasion. The scholar observes, one of the real issues that arises from reading ancient rhetorical documents is a dawning awareness of how different ancient culture was from our own in so many ways. Most of us have had the experience of recognizing that humor is very culture-specific. What might well appear manipulative in one cultural setting might appear quite normal and appropriate in another. A classic example of this can be seen in Paul's little letter to Philemon. When we cross the chasm of 2 millennia to read the New Testament, we must be acutely aware of our own cultural baggage. The rules of engagement, the acceptable boundaries of debate, and the very definitions of polite discourse have radically shifted. In our modern, highly individualized Western context, we tend to prize dispassionate logic, privacy, and personal autonomy in decision-making. However, the first-century Mediterranean world was deeply collectivistic, driven by fierce dynamics of honor and shame, patronage, and public standing. In such a world, persuasion naturally utilized tools that we might instinctively recoil from today. The short letter to Philemon is a perfect test case. Paul is attempting to secure the freedom and brotherly acceptance of a runaway slave named Onesimus. To achieve this, Paul does not write a private, confidential memo. He addresses the letter to Philemon and to the entire church that meets in his home, ensuring that Philemon's response will be a matter of intense public scrutiny. The author expands on this cultural dissonance, noting, "It is safe to say that many modern persons would find this letter highly manipulative and too emotive." This would not be seen as an example of fighting fairly or persuading properly. The line between persuasion and manipulation is a moving one depending on time, culture, social and rhetorical conventions in a given culture. What I would stress is that everything Paul does in this letter is completely normal and accepted practice in his age. By modern standards, Paul's tactics in Philemon seem heavy-handed. He reminds Philemon that he is an old man in chains. He plays on the meaning of Onesimus's name. He subtly reminds Philemon that he owes Paul his very spiritual life, and he pointedly announces his intention to visit, effectively demanding to inspect the results of his request. To a modern sensibility, this borders on emotional blackmail. Yet, in the arena of ancient Asiatic rhetoric, this is a masterclass in the art of insinuatio and emotional appeal. Paul is leveraging every ounce of his apostolic ethos and the profound societal obligations of reciprocity to achieve a beautiful, redemptive outcome for a marginalized slave. He is applying maximum, culturally appropriate pressure to force a radical restructuring of a household's social dynamics. If we dismiss Paul's rhetoric here as unethical or overly manipulative, we commit a grave historical fallacy. We fail to appreciate the incredible rhetorical dexterity required to navigate the perilous social hierarchies of the ancient world for the sake of the gospel of Christ. Our discussion continues with illustration 6, enthymemes and missing premises. The text points out, we have discussed enthymemes at several junctures in this study, and it is fair to say that without recognizing both the form and implications of an enthymeme it becomes difficult if not impossible to see the logic of texts like Mark's Gospel, 1 John, James or Titus and 1 Timothy, where we find more than a few of these compressed forms of rhetorical argument. An enthymeme is essentially an incomplete rhetorical syllogism. It is a form of deductive reasoning where one of the premises, or sometimes the final conclusion itself, is deliberately suppressed or left unstated by the speaker. Why would an ancient orator do this? Aristotle noted that stating the obvious is not only tedious, but it can actually be insulting to the intelligence of the audience. By leaving a crucial step in the logical chain unspoken, the rhetorician invites the audience to actively participate in the creation of the argument. The listeners must reach into their own shared knowledge, their cultural assumptions, or their prior theological training to supply the missing piece, thereby convincing themselves of the truth of the statement. The pastoral epistles, because they are written to trusted co-workers who already share a vast reservoir of theological understanding with Paul, are absolutely teeming with these compressed, shorthand arguments. The author provides a clear example, stating, a further good example of this sort of ethical argumentation can be seen in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verses 17 and 18. 1. Those who labor in speaking and teaching are worthy of their wages. 2. Because the scripture says so, and it also says that even the ox should get some benefit from its labor. 3. Unexpressed premise, elders are like laborers and therefore are worthy of the honor of being paid. Failure to see the hidden premise will inevitably lead to a misunderstanding of this or that part of the argument. When modern scholars read the pastoral epistles without an awareness of enthymematic reasoning, they often conclude that the letters are poorly constructed, disjointed, or simply a random collection of unrelated ethical maxims. They accuse the author of jumping erratically from one topic to the next without any coherent logical flow. However, once we recognize that the author is employing enthymemes, the underlying architectonic structure of the letters brilliantly emerges. The arguments are not missing. They are merely awaiting the active engagement of the informed reader. When Paul quotes the proverb about the ox treading the grain, he fully expects Timothy to seamlessly connect the agrarian metaphor to the grueling, daily labor of the local church elders. By recognizing these implied premises, we unlock the profound theological and practical coherency of the pastorals, proving that they are not the haphazard scribblings of a later redactor, but the concise, highly effective rhetorical instructions of a seasoned apostle communicating with his closest delegates. We now examine illustration 7, personification in rhetorical discourse. The author writes, many scholars do recognize that there are all sorts of personifications in the New Testament, because they accept that micro-rhetoric is part of the mostly undisputed literary devices found commonly in the New Testament. The problem is, they do not realize with personifications there were specific rhetorical rules on how to use them, rules that are being followed by various New Testament writers. Personification is a familiar literary concept, but in the context of ancient Greco-Roman education, it was a highly formalized rhetorical technique with specific strategic applications. It was not merely a poetic flourish to make a sentence sound more beautiful. When a New Testament author chooses to personify an abstract concept, they are signaling to the audience that this concept carries profound theological weight and active, dynamic power within the narrative they are constructing. We see this vividly in the book of Romans, where sin and death are personified almost as tyrannical monarchs reigning over humanity. This is not just a metaphor. It is a rhetorical strategy designed to portray the human condition as an active subjugation to hostile cosmic forces, which in turn magnifies the triumphant, liberating power of God's grace. The author elaborates on the precise rules governing this device, noting, personification was an important rhetorical device that one had to use cautiously without overdoing it. It was known as a rhetorical figure, which involved giving a voice to things to which nature has denied it, according to Quintilian. More specifically, it involved personifying abstract qualities and virtues such as fame, pleasure, life and death, or virtue itself. The rhetorical function of this device is to highlight the importance of the quality being discussed. A spectacular example of this highly regulated use of personification occurs in the letter to Titus. In chapter 3 verse 4, Paul writes about the moment when the goodness and the loving kindness of God our Savior appeared. In the original Greek, these abstract qualities, goodness and philanthropia, are treated almost as active agents making a grand entrance onto the world stage. Crucially, this language was the exact terminology used in the imperial ruler cults to describe the benevolence of the Roman emperor. By personifying these specific virtues and attaching them exclusively to the revelation of Jesus Christ, Paul is executing a daring rhetorical subversion. He is essentially telling his audience that the true manifestation of divine goodness and love for humanity did not appear in the palaces of Rome or in the decrees of Caesar, but in the incarnate reality of Jesus. Understanding the strict rhetorical conventions surrounding personification allows us to fully appreciate the profound, anti-imperial, and deeply Christological claims embedded within these seemingly simple poetic phrases. Turning to our next point, we discuss illustration 8, amplification as a rhetorical strategy. The text observes, scholars not familiar with rhetorical conventions have often complained about the sheer redundancy and lack of logical flow of some of the documents of the New Testament, particularly sermons like James, 1 John, or even Hebrews. Others, not wishing to accuse the New Testament writers of mere redundancy, have instead tried to find small nuances of difference between sentences that only have slight variations of vocabulary or form. This observation highlights a common pitfall in modern exegesis. When we read a text like the first epistle of John, we are immediately struck by its cyclical, repetitive nature. The author circles back again and again to the themes of light and darkness, love and hate, truth and falsehood. To a modern reader trained to value linear, progressive argumentation and concise prose, this repetition feels incredibly tedious. It appears as though the author is simply spinning his wheels, lacking the intellectual rigor to advance a coherent thesis. Consequently, some commentators attempt to salvage the text by desperately over-exegeting minor vocabulary shifts, trying to find profound new theological doctrines in every slightly altered repeated phrase. However, this entirely misses the mark. The repetitive nature of these texts is not a bug. It is a feature. It is the deliberate deployment of a highly respected rhetorical tool. The author explains the function of this tool, noting, as we have already noted, amplification is a rhetorical technique mainly associated with epideictic rhetoric and of course with sermons or homilies. Instead of the probatio being a series of arguments proving a proposition or thesis statement, it is rather dedicated to amplifying, expanding, and expounding on certain key ideas and themes that are already familiar and accepted. Lest we mistake what is going on in 1 John, none of this need mean our author has a very limited vocabulary. It means he is trying to be emphatic by means of repetition. Amplification, or ergasia, was a core component of epideictic discourse. The goal of epideictic rhetoric is not to teach the audience something entirely new or to debate a controversial point. The goal is to deeply reinforce values that the community already holds dear, especially in the wake of a crisis or schism, which is exactly the situation behind 1 John. The author uses amplification to emotionally anchor his audience to the foundational truths of the apostolic gospel. By repeating the necessity of love and the reality of the incarnation through various synonymous phrases and stark contrasts, the rhetorician drives the truth deep into the hearts of the listeners. It is a pedagogical strategy designed for maximum oral impact. Recognizing amplification as a legitimate and powerful rhetorical strategy frees us from the exhausting task of searching for microscopic theological differences in every repeated verse, and allows us to experience the text as it was intended, as a resonant, emphatic, and deeply pastoral symphony of truth. This brings us to illustration 9, the aesthetics of Asiatic rhetoric. The author points out, one of the problems non-rhetorically trained scholars have, who like to see themselves as good evaluators of literary style and vocabulary, is that Asiatic rhetoric does not suit their aesthetic sensibilities. It does not fit modern literary canons, like the notion that perspicuity and succinctness are chief virtues of a good style. Asiatic rhetoric, in other words, is too Rococo or Baroque or Victorian for some modern tastes. It is a fundamental truth of historical inquiry that we must not judge ancient artifacts by modern aesthetic standards. In contemporary writing, we prize brevity, clarity, and getting straight to the point. We are taught to eliminate unnecessary adjectives and avoid overly flowery prose. However, in the ancient Mediterranean, particularly in the eastern provinces like Asia Minor, a completely different stylistic ideal often reigned supreme. This was the Asiatic style of rhetoric. It was characterized by highly ornate, emotionally charged, and intensely elaborate language. It favored long, sweeping sentences, a vast and unusual vocabulary, and a rhythmic, almost musical delivery. To a modern ear, it can sound incredibly pompous and artificially inflated. But to an ancient audience, this was the height of literary and oratorical sophistication. It was the style utilized by the greatest public speakers to convey matters of profound importance and intense emotional gravity. The author applies this to a specific text, observing, to moderns like ourselves, on first glance, the style of 2 Peter will by and large seem to be an example of a person overcome with the exuberance of his own verbosity, loving rare words, the coining of terms, solemn, sonorous, and grandiloquent language and phrasing. In other words, a lofty subject deserved a grand style. Style was often a matter of choice, not a mere accident of one's individual vocabulary and grammar, and when one chose to use Asiatic Greek style and rhetoric on top of that, all kinds of things come into play that will not be apparent to those who do not recognize these conventions. 2 Peter is perhaps the premier example of Asiatic rhetoric in the New Testament. Its vocabulary is packed with rare words found nowhere else in the biblical text. Its sentences are complex and majestic. Because modern scholars often find this style utterly distasteful, they frequently dismiss the epistle as a late, pseudepigraphical forgery written by a clumsy imitator trying too hard to sound important. This is a tragic failure of historical imagination. The author of 2 Peter is writing about the most awe-inspiring subjects imaginable, the cosmic dissolution of the heavens and the earth, the final judgment, and the spectacular return of Jesus Christ in glory. In the ancient world, such a terrifyingly lofty subject absolutely demanded the grand, Asiatic style. The ornate vocabulary and sweeping cadences were a deliberate, highly educated choice designed to match the majestic theological content. To dismiss the text because it violates our modern preference for brevity is to completely misunderstand the rhetorical landscape of the ancient world. Our final specific example is illustration 10, micro-rhetoric and the gradation. The text states, for our last illustration of the difference knowing rhetoric makes in the interpretation of a New Testament text we focus on a small rhetorical device called a sorites or gradation. Since we have not discussed this matter previously, we will deal with it in some detail, using the gradation found in 2 Peter chapter 1 verses 5 through 7 as the taking off point, but referring to the examples in Romans 5 and Philippians 4 as well. This device is used to build to a climax with a stress on the last item in a list as the most important or needing most emphasis. The gradation, also known as a chain link progression, is a fascinating micro-rhetorical tool. It creates a staircase of concepts, where the end of one clause becomes the beginning of the next, leading the audience upward step by step toward a grand conclusion. We see this brilliantly executed in 2 Peter, where the author commands the believers to supplement their faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. This is not merely a random grocery list of nice things a Christian should do. It is a carefully constructed rhetorical staircase. By recognizing the formal structure of the gradatio, we understand that the ultimate goal, the absolute pinnacle of the Christian life that the author is driving toward, is agape, or selfless Christian love. All the other virtues are foundational steps leading to this supreme relational reality. The author further clarifies the mechanics of this device, noting, without question, the rhetorical device being used in the virtue catalog in 2 Peter chapter 1 is sorites or gradatio, providing us with an ascending chain of virtues that leads to the supreme virtue, Christian love. It is a device which involves repetition, something near to the heart of Asiatic rhetoricians. It takes the form A leads to B leads to C leads to D, and so on. In 2 Peter, to supply further means to add more. In addition, it is not at all clear how some of these virtues could be said to be produced by the preceding virtue, but it is not difficult to see how they could be added to them. This is a crucial exegetically insight. Some interpreters, analyzing the Greek verbs too rigidly without rhetorical awareness, have argued that the author is claiming that faith organically or biologically produces virtue, and virtue organically produces knowledge, in a strict chain of cause and effect. But as the author rightly points out, this stretches logic to the breaking point. How exactly does steadfastness naturally manufacture brotherly affection? It doesn't. When we understand the gradatio as a rhetorical figure designed for emphasis and accumulation, we see that the author is commanding believers to actively gather and add these virtues to their lives, one upon another, building a robust Christian character. The rhetoric instructs us to view this as a cumulative pursuit of moral excellence culminating in love, rather than a strict, deterministic sequence of psychological production. As we transition to our concluding thoughts, we arrive at the postscript, the rhetoric of preaching in continuity. The author brings our attention to a broader historical perspective, noting, in her landmark study, Christianity and the Rhetoric of Empire, Averell Cameron shows at length just how very much the increasingly Gentile church over the course of the first 4 Christian centuries developed their own special ways of using Greco-Roman rhetoric to their advantage, with the end result being that Christians eventually persuaded a majority of persons in the Roman Empire that being a Christian was the best of all possible religion options. This is perhaps one of the most astonishing realities of human history. How did a small, marginalized, and frequently persecuted sect from the eastern fringes of the Mediterranean manage to completely conquer the vast, pluralistic, and highly sophisticated Roman Empire? They did not do it through military might or economic coercion. They did it through the unparalleled power of the spoken word. The early Christians adopted, adapted, and ultimately mastered the prevailing discourse of their day. They took the tools of classical rhetoric, tools designed for the Senate and the law courts, and weaponized them for the gospel. They out-preached, out-debated, and out-persuaded their pagan contemporaries. They crafted a new, incredibly compelling narrative that addressed the deepest longings and anxieties of the ancient world. To ignore the rhetorical genius of the early church is to remain entirely blind to the primary engine of its explosive historical success. The author underscores this continuity, writing, "What Cameron demonstrates at length is that early church history, so far as its public and private discourse was concerned, continued to be indebted to Greco-Roman rhetoric through and through." We should not think then that the rhetoric in the New Testament was an isolated phenomenon which died out after the 1st century CE. To the contrary, the rhetoric of early Christianity only increased over time, and its greatest practitioners, such as John Chrysostom, recognized in the New Testament authors, their mentors, and forebears in the use of the rhetorical arts. The rhetorical strategies we find in the letters of Paul or the sermons of Peter and John were not a temporary, 1st century aberration. They were the foundational seeds of a massive intellectual and communicative tradition that spanned centuries. The great Church Fathers, the brilliant apologists and theologians of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, were all classically trained rhetoricians. When giants like John Chrysostom or Augustine stood up to preach, they did so in explicit continuity with the rhetorical legacy established by the apostles. They recognized that to effectively communicate the profound truths of the Christian faith, one must utilize the most effective communicative tools available in the culture. This historical continuity serves as a vital reminder to us today. If the gospel is to continue its leavening work in our own complex, pluralistic society, modern communicators and homileticians would do incredibly well to study the ancient art of persuasion, recognizing that the power of the message is intrinsically linked to the effectiveness of its delivery. Finally, we address the critical issue of historical plausibility, Paul the educated reader. The author tackles a common objection head-on, stating, perhaps however, your real issue with analyzing the New Testament on the basis of Greco-Roman rhetoric comes from your analysis of the historical situation of the earliest Christians. The argument goes something like this. Not many of the earliest Christians were among the social elites of society. This means not many of them got what one might call a higher education. Since they did not have a higher education, they would not have known the full taxonomy of Greco-Roman rhetoric. This objection sounds entirely plausible to a modern ear accustomed to romanticized notions of the early church as a purely grassroots, proletarian movement. If the apostles were merely simple fishermen and uneducated laborers, how could they possibly compose documents featuring complex rhetorical syncresis or sophisticated chain-link transitions? The assumption is that analyzing the text for such features is fundamentally ahistorical. However, this entire objection is built upon a house of sand. It willfully ignores the massive impact of Hellenization across the entire Mediterranean basin, including Judea and Galilee. Greek culture, language, and educational practices had been deeply integrated into Jewish life for centuries prior to the birth of Jesus. The author systematically dismantles this myth, asserting, the notion that early Christianity was led by a bunch of illiterate Jewish peasants is an historical myth. There were schools and teachers of rhetoric all over the empire, including some of the more famous rhetoricians right in and around Galilee. If early Christianity really was an evangelistic religion wanting to persuade a Greek-speaking world about the odd notion that a crucified manual worker from Nazareth rose from the dead and was King of Kings and Lord of Lords, this was going to take some persuasion, and the chief tool in the arsenal of all well-known persuaders, orators, rhetoricians in the Greco-Roman world was rhetoric. The historical reality is that early Christianity drew from a broad cross-section of society, including highly educated and socially prominent individuals. The Apostle Paul himself was a Roman citizen, raised in Jerusalem, and trained under the elite Pharisee Gamaliel. The sheer sophistication of his Greek, his ability to seamlessly weave Old Testament exegesis with Greco-Roman rhetorical tropes, and his masterful adaptation of his style to diverse audiences across the empire prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he possessed a formidable, tertiary-level education. He was a master rhetorician. To deny this is to deny the explicit historical and textual evidence. If we accept that the early church was fundamentally an evangelistic movement striving to convert a skeptical, highly educated pagan world to a shockingly countercultural message, it is absolute historical folly to suggest they would not have utilized the primary cultural weapon of persuasion available to them. Understanding the New Testament requires us to acknowledge and appreciate the profound rhetorical genius of its authors.